Day 20, Part 1. Good afternoon. Jorge decides to live in Brazilian soccer stadium. Jorge asks where the soccer stadium is. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Good afternoon. Jorge decides to live in Brazilian soccer stadium. Jorge asks where the soccer stadium is. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Part 2A. Present. Jorge decides to live in Brazilian soccer stadium. Does Jorge decides to live in church? No, Jorge decides to soccer stadium. To live in soccer stadium. Jorge decides to soccer stadium. He decides to live in stadium. Where does Jorge decide to live in stadium? Decide to live in stadium. Does Jorge decides to live in school? No, Jorge decides to live in the soccer stadium. Where does Jorge decides to live? Decides to live in the soccer stadium. He decides to live in soccer stadium. Does Jorge decide to live in the soccer working stadium? No, Jorge decides to live in soccer stadium. Part 2B. Pass. Jorge decides to live in Brazilian soccer stadium. Did Jorge decides to live in the shore? No, Jorge decides to live in the soccer stadium. Jorge decides to live in the stadium. He decides to live in the stadium. Where does Jorge decide? Jorge decides to live in the stadium. Did Jorge decide to live in school? No. Jorge decides to live in the soccer stadium. Where is Jorge to decide to live? In the stadium. Jorge decides to live in the stadium. In the stadium. He decides to live in a working stadium? No working stadium. He lives in a stadium. Part 3A. Present. Jorge asks where the soccer stadium is. Does Jorge start the store where store is? So Jorge asks where the soccer. He asks where the stadium is. Where does Jorge ask? Jorge asks where the stadium is. He asks that. Does Jorge asked who Manuel is. No, Jorge asked which soccer stadium. Who asked? He asked where stadium. In stadium. Part 3b. Pass. Jorge asks what a soccer stadium is. This soccer. Jorge asks, do you store Burjok? No, Jorge asks the soccer stadium it was. Is. What does Jorge ask? He asked what stadium was. He asked that. Did Jorge ask what Manuel asked? No, Jorge asked what stadium was. Who asked? Jorge. Jorge asked what stadium was. Part 4a. Present. Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. Does Jorge live in Mexico for a long time? No. Jorge decides to live in Brazil for a long time. He lives in Brazil. How long to live to Brazil for a long time. He lives for a long time. Does Jorge live in Brazil for 2 years? No, Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. Does Jorge live in Brazil for a short time? Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time, no short. He lives for a long time. Where is Jorge live? In Brazil. Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. Part 4b. Pass. Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. Did Jorge lives in Mexico for a long time? Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. No, Mexico. He lives in Brazil for a long time. How long in Brazil for a long time. He lives in Brazil for a long time. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Does Jorge live in Brazil for 2 years? No, for a long time. Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. Did Jorge to Brazil for a short time? No, Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Where is Jorge live? in Brazil. Jorge lived in Brazil for a long time. He lives in Brazil. Part 5. You, Jorge, travel to Brazil by plane. You think that port culture is interesting. You ask for the soccer stadium. You want to practice Portuguese. You want to write better and read better. You're happy to go to Brazil. You think improve Portuguese. You want to live in Brazil forever. Have a good day. Personal question. What country do you want to forever? Do you stay?